The air in the courtroom felt like it was made of frozen lead. It was thick, heavy, and smelled faintly of floor wax and old, expensive cologne, the kind Lysander always wore. I sat there, my spine pressed against the hard wooden chair, feeling the weight of 4 pairs of eyes drilling into me. My husband, Lysander St. James, leaned in closer than he had in months. His breath, smelling of mint and cold ambition, brushed against my ear. "You will never touch a dime of my money again," he whispered. It wasn't a threat, it was a sentence. He said it with the casual confidence of a man who had already won the game. Across from him, my mother-in-law, Octavia, let a small, sharp smirk pull at her lips. For 8 years, that woman had looked at me like I was a stain on her Persian rug, something inconvenient she had accidentally stepped in and couldn't wait to scrape off. Beside her, Pearl, my father-in-law, sat like a granite statue. He didn't even look at me. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a failed investment, a line item that was finally being deleted. And then there was Kalista Royale. She sat with the grace of a panther, her fingers idly adjusting the diamonds around her neck, diamonds that probably cost more than the house I grew up in. She was the daughter of Royale Holdings, the upgrade they had all chosen for Lysander. She looked at me with a pity that burned worse than hatred. But then, the atmosphere shifted. The judge, a woman who looked like she had seen every lie the city of Atlanta had to offer, opened my envelope. She began to read. Silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Then, she did something no one expected. She laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a deep, belly-aching laugh that made her take off her glasses to wipe away tears. "This is the best thing I've read in 20 years on the bench," she declared, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She looked at me, her eyes dancing with a newfound respect. "But before we proceed, please, for the record, state your full name. I'm curious to know exactly who is sharing this courtroom with me today." I looked at Lysander. His smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He didn't know. None of them knew. They thought they were divorcing Aziza, the middle-class girl from a regular apartment in Decatur. They thought they were discarding a butterfly they had pinned under glass. They had no idea who I really was. 8 years ago, I thought I had won the lottery of fate. I remember the night I met Lysander at that corporate gala. He moved through the room with the precision of a surgeon, his profile looking like it had been carved from obsidian. He was old money, aristocracy, the kind of man who didn't just walk into a room, he owned the air inside it. When he approached me, I felt like the sun had finally decided to shine on me alone. I was pretty enough for the family portraits, but, as I realize now, I was selected because I seemed naive enough for unquestioning obedience. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a technical blueprint of a wife. The first 3 years in the St. James mansion in Buckhead were an ecstatic fog. I woke up every morning to floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private pine forest. The furniture was Italian, shipped via special cargo, and the lawn was so perfectly manicured it looked like a green velvet stage. I was a girl from a modest background, and the sheer scale of his wealth made my head spin. Lysander was the perfect husband back then. He brought flowers every Friday. He kissed my forehead every night. He would tell his elite colleagues, "I got incredibly lucky with Aziza." And I believed him. I believed in the fairy tale with a stubbornness that I now realize was my greatest weakness. The shift was subtle, like the slow cooling of a room. It started over a dinner of perfectly seared steak. Lysander was slicing his meat with that terrifyingly precise movement his father had taught him. "Aziza," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "We were talking about children. How do you intend to combine motherhood with working at that agency of yours?" I remember my cheeks flushing. I told him I loved my job, that I had worked hard to become a director. He just smiled, that benevolent, savior-like smile. "Let's be honest, sweetheart. The pennies you earn barely cover your gas to the office. St. James Development brings in enough for both of us. Don't you want to create a real home? Like my mother?" At the mention of Octavia, my back straightened automatically. It was a conditioned reflex. Octavia was a woman with X-ray vision, capable of finding a flaw in the very fabric of my existence. Lysander reached across the table and took my hand. "I just want our children to have a real mother, not an exhausted career woman," he said softly. A month later, I was standing in my office, watching a gray February sky, signing my resignation. My colleagues were envious. They thought I had hit the jackpot. I felt like I was signing a surrender. "Now everything will be simpler," Lysander told me as he handed me a bank card. He acted like he was granting me freedom, but it was a golden cage. He told me the card had a limit for household needs, and if I needed more, I just had to ask. Just ask. Those 2 words became the biggest lie of my life. Every request became an interrogation. Why did I need a new dress? Was the blue one worn out? Why was the grocery bill $300? He would demand receipts for a cup of coffee. He was a man who owned half the skyline, yet he counted the pennies I spent on bread. Gradually, he began to isolate me. I stopped meeting friends because I didn't want to explain why I couldn't split the bill. I stopped buying books because he said we had a Kindle. I stopped going to yoga because he said I could watch videos at home. He was an entomologist, and I was his specimen. He watched me wither with a look of pure satisfaction. He would tell me I was a wonderful hostess, while his mother, Octavia, arrived in her Bentley to conduct forensic audits of my dinner table. "The forks are too far from the plates, Aziza," she would sneer. "The napkins are folded incorrectly. And hydrangeas? How provincial." Pearl St. James was even worse. In 8 years, he spoke to me 3 times. Each time it was, "Pass the salt." To him, I was furniture. But then, Kalista Royale entered the picture. Octavia announced it at dinner, her voice filled with viper's venom. "She's the daughter of Magnus Royale, a talented designer. She can refresh the guest rooms. They look so provincial." I had decorated those rooms myself. I had put my soul into them. But Lysander just nodded, his eyes already searching for a woman who wasn't me. When Kalista arrived, I knew I was in trouble. She was a goddess in heels that cost my annual allowance, and the way Lysander looked at her, it wasn't the way a man looks at a designer, it was the way a man looks at his future. I was a fool. I stayed, I smiled, and I ignored the late nights and the scent of new cologne. Until I found the receipt. $600 for a dinner at the Apex. Wagyu steak, Dom Perignon, chocolate fondant. A romantic menu for 2 on a night Lysander said he was working late. It wasn't the cheating that broke me. It was the price tag. He fought me over a $5 coffee while spending a fortune on her. That was the moment the naive Aziza died. That was the moment I realized that if they wanted to play a game of money and power, I would have to learn the rules. And I would have to win. The realization of Lysander's betrayal didn't come as a sudden explosion. It was a cold, numbing frost that settled over my heart. As I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed that night, the receipt from the Apex restaurant felt like a brand against my skin. $600. To him, it was a rounding error. To me, it was a symbol of the financial leash he had used to choke the life out of my independence for nearly a decade. I looked at him sleeping. His face was so calm, so entitled. He slept with the peace of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had no idea that the butterfly had just grown teeth. The next morning, I didn't make his favorite organic green juice. I didn't ensure his dry-cleaned suit was laid out with the precision of a museum exhibit. Instead, I waited. I waited until the roar of his Porsche faded down the driveway. Then, I moved. My first stop was his private office. In 8 years, I had entered that room only to clean or to bring him coffee. It was his sanctuary, a temple of mahogany and leather where the real business of the St. James family was conducted. Finding the key was easy. Lysander was arrogant. He believed I was too broken, too provincial, to ever dare spy on him. The bronze eagle statue on his desk was heavy, but the key hidden beneath its base felt heavier. When I unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk, I expected to find love letters or perhaps photos of Kalista. What I found was much more valuable. I found the architecture of my own destruction, and his. There were folders labeled North Vest Holding. I had never heard the name. As I flipped through the pages, my breath hitched. These weren't just business contracts, they were shell company agreements. Lysander was moving millions of dollars out of St. James Development and into these private accounts. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Jersey. The numbers were astronomical. Tens of millions of dollars were being siphoned away, hidden from the family firm, and more importantly, hidden from me in the event of a divorce. He wasn't just planning to leave me, he was planning to leave me destitute while he built a secret empire to share with Kalista Royale. But Lysander had made one fatal mistake. He assumed I was just a pretty girl from Decatur who didn't understand finance. He forgot that before I became a St. James wife, I was a senior account director who managed multi-million-dollar budgets for top-tier firms. I knew how to read a balance sheet better than he did. I spent the next 4 hours with my phone, scanning every single document. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer rush of adrenaline. I was no longer a victim, I was a hunter. As I worked, I remembered the dinner with Magnus Royale and the way my father-in-law, Pearl, had looked at him. They weren't just merging families, they were merging titans. St. James Development was struggling. I could see it in the internal memos. They needed the Royale capital to survive. Lysander was the sacrificial lamb being offered to Kalista to save the family legacy. And I was the trash that needed to be cleared away before the wedding bells could ring. I left the office exactly as I found it. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, my mind racing. If I confronted him now, he would use his high-priced lawyers to bury me. He would claim I stole the documents. He would make me look like a delusional, bitter wife. No, I needed more. I needed to see how deep the Royale connection went. That afternoon, I drove to the city's most prestigious law firm, not the one the St. James family used, but their fiercest rival, Sterling and Vance. I didn't book an appointment under my own name. I used my maiden name and wore a wig and sunglasses, feeling like a character in a spy novel. When I finally sat across from a senior partner, a woman named Elena Vance, who was known for being a shark in high-asset divorces, I laid the scans on the table. Elena looked at the documents for a long time. She didn't speak. She just adjusted her glasses and zoomed in on the Northwest Holding signatures. Then she looked up at me. "Do you know what this is, Mrs. St. James?" she asked, her voice low. "It's a shell company," I replied. "He's hiding assets." Elena smiled, and it was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. "It's more than that. This is tax evasion on a federal level, but more interestingly for you, he's been using these funds to buy properties in Kalista Royale's name. He's been gifting her your marital assets for 2 years. In the eyes of the law, that's dissipation of marital funds. You don't just get half of what's in his bank account, Aziza. You might be entitled to half of the entire Royale St. James merger." The drive back to Buckhead felt different. The pine trees didn't look like prison bars anymore. They looked like scenery. When I got home, the Bentley was in the driveway. Octavia was there. She was sitting in the solarium, sipping tea and looking at a bridal magazine. She didn't even hide it. She looked at a photo of a Vera Wang gown and then looked at me as I walked in. "Aziza," she said, her voice like cracking ice, "we need to have a conversation about the future. Lysander is evolving. His needs are changing. A man of his stature requires a certain kind of partner, someone who can navigate the waters of international business, not someone who gets excited about Whole Foods coupons." I stood there, looking at her. For 8 years, I would have apologized. I would have felt small. But today, I just smiled. "I couldn't agree more, Octavia," I said. "A man like Lysander deserves exactly what is coming to him." She narrowed her eyes, sensed a change in my tone, but brushed it off. "I'm glad you're being sensible. We've prepared a separation agreement. It's generous, considering you brought nothing to this marriage but your student loans, which we graciously paid off." She slid a folder across the marble table. "Sign it, and you can leave with your dignity, and perhaps that little Honda of yours." I didn't open the folder. I knew what was in it. A pittance. A thank you for your service check that would run out in a year. I looked at the woman who had spent a decade trying to make me feel like dirt. I thought about the diamonds on Kalista's neck. I thought about the secret accounts in the Cayman Islands. "I'll take it to my lawyer," I said calmly. Octavia laughed, a dry, sharp sound. "Your lawyer? With what money? You don't have an account that Lysander doesn't monitor. Don't be tedious, Aziza. Just sign and go back to Decatur. I picked up the folder and turned toward the stairs. I think I'll keep the folder as a souvenir, Octavia. It's a wonderful example of how little you think of me. It's been your biggest mistake. That night, Lysander didn't come home. He didn't even call. I sat in the dark of our bedroom, watching the moon reflect off the Italian furniture. I wasn't crying. I was calculating. I realized that to win, I couldn't just be a wife seeking a divorce. I had to become the ghost in his machine. I had to wait for the Royale merger to reach its peak. I had to wait for the moment when the St. James family was most vulnerable. I began to live a double life. By day, I was the obedient, quiet wife, enduring Octavia's insults and Lysander's coldness. By night, I was working with Elena Vance, tracing the digital breadcrumbs of the Northwest Holding Company. We found something even bigger, a signature on a contract that didn't belong to Lysander. It belonged to Pearl St. James. They were all in on it. They weren't just hiding money from me. They were defrauding their own investors. I was no longer just looking for a divorce settlement. I was holding the detonator to their entire dynasty. And as I watched Kalista Royale post pictures of her new penthouse on Instagram, a penthouse bought with the money Lysander told me we didn't have, I felt a cold, sharp joy. The stage was set. The players were in place. All I had to do was wait for the curtain to rise. Being a ghost in your own home is a strange, haunting experience. For the next 3 months, I lived as a shadow within the whitewashed walls of the St. James mansion. I became the perfect, invisible wife. I stopped asking for money. I stopped questioning the late nights. When Lysander would come home at 2 a.m, smelling of expensive bourbon and Kalista's heavy floral perfume, I didn't greet him with tears or accusations. I simply turned over in bed, my eyes wide open in the dark, counting the seconds until the dawn of my new life. Lysander, in his boundless arrogance, took my silence for brokenness. He truly believed he had finally managed to crush my spirit. He became careless. He started taking business calls in front of me, speaking in rapid-fire jargon about equity swaps and capital infusions. He thought I was just the background noise of his life, like the hum of the refrigerator or the rustle of the wind in the pines. He didn't realize I was a sponge, soaking up every name, every date, and every dollar amount he uttered. Every morning, after the gates of the estate closed behind his Porsche, my real work began. I didn't go to the mall or the spa. I went to a small, dusty public library in a part of town where no St. James would ever set foot. There, on a public computer that couldn't be traced to our home network, I logged into the encrypted portal Elena Vance had set up for me. We were digging deeper into Northwest Holding. It wasn't just a piggy bank for his mistress, it was a laundry machine. I discovered that Lysander was using the company to buy up distressed properties in the very neighborhoods St. James Development was planning to revitalize. He was front-running his own family's company, buying low through Northwest and selling high to St. James Development once the projects were approved by the city council. It was textbook insider trading and self-dealing, and the paper trail led directly to a series of offshore accounts that were growing like a virus. One rainy Tuesday, Elena called me with a voice that sounded like she'd just struck gold. "Aziza, you need to see this. I found the link to Royale Holdings." I hurried to her office, my heart hammering against my ribs. She laid out a map of financial transactions that looked like a spider's web. In the center was Magnus Royale. It turned out the talented interior designer, Kalista, wasn't just a mistress, she was a conduit. Magnus Royale was using his daughter to funnel black money into Lysander's shell companies. In exchange, the St. James family was giving Royale Holdings a controlling interest in the new Midtown waterfront project, a multi-billion-dollar deal that was the crown jewel of Atlanta's real estate scene. "They aren't just marrying for status, Aziza," Elena whispered, leaning over the mahogany desk. "This is a criminal conspiracy. If this merger goes through, they'll be too big to fail. But right now, while the contracts are still being signed, they are incredibly exposed. If the SEC or the IRS got a look at these consulting fees Lysander is paying Kalista, the whole house of cards would come down." I look at the photos of Kalista and Lysander at a recent charity gala. They looked like royalty. I looked like a ghost. "I don't want them in jail yet," I said, my voice sounding colder than I recognized. "I want them to feel what I felt. I want them to watch everything they love being stripped away, piece by piece, while they stand there helpless." Elena nodded slowly. "Then we wait for the closing, the night of the Royale St. James merger gala. That's when all the signatures will be on one document. That's when we strike." Returning to the mansion that evening was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I had to sit through a dinner with Octavia and Pearl. The air was thick with their smugness. Octavia was talking about the guest list for the spring celebration, which I knew was actually a thinly veiled engagement party for Lysander and Kalista. "We'll need you to stay in the background that night, Aziza," Octavia said, barely looking up from her salad. "Kalista will be hosting. It's important that the investors see a certain image of the future. You understand, don't you? You can handle the catering staff from the kitchen. It's what you're best at, after all." I felt the familiar sting of her words, but this time, it didn't burn. It was just data. "Of course, Octavia," I said smoothly. "I'll make sure everything is perfect. I want this to be a night no one ever forgets." Pearl looked at me then, a rare occurrence. His eyes were hard, calculating. "You've been very quiet lately, Aziza. No more complaints about the allowance? No more begging for a new car?" "I've realized that I have everything I deserve, Pearl," I replied, meeting his gaze. He didn't like that. He preferred me flinching. He grunted and went back to his wine, dismissed by my apparent submission. But the real test came later that night. Lysander came into our bedroom, looking energized, his eyes bright with the thrill of the deal. He sat on the edge of the bed and actually looked at me. "You know, Aziza," he said, his voice dropping into that fake intimate register he used when he wanted something, "I've appreciated how you've handled things lately. My mother says you're finally learning your place. After the merger is finalized next month, I'll make sure you're taken care of. A nice condo in Florida, maybe. A fresh start for you." "A fresh start," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "And what about us, Lysander?" He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Let's not be sentimental. We've outgrown each other. You were a beautiful distraction for a few years, but I'm moving into a different league now. You should be grateful. Most girls from Decatur don't even get to see the inside of a house like this." He reached out to pat my cheek, a gesture so patronizing it made my skin crawl. I didn't pull away. I let him touch me. I let him believe he was the master of my universe. Because I knew something he didn't. I knew that every time he used his St. James development laptop to message Kalista or check his offshore balances, a keylogger I had installed was sending every keystroke directly to Elena Vance. I knew that he had just authorized a $5 million transfer from a company account into a private trust for Kalista. I knew that he was planning to serve me with divorce papers the morning after the gala, leaving me with nothing but a suitcase and a few $1,000s. As he turned off the light and fell into a deep, smug sleep, I lay there in the darkness. I thought about the girl I was 8 years ago, the one who believed in Friday flowers and forehead kisses. I felt a pang of sorrow for her, but it was brief. She was gone. In her place was someone forged in the fire of humiliation and sharpened by the ice of betrayal. The gala of the century was only 2 weeks away. The invitations had been sent, heavy, gold-embossed cards that signaled the union of 2 dynasties. Little did they know, I had sent out a few invitations of my own. I had contacted a few old friends from my days at the advertising agency, people who now worked in high-stakes financial journalism. I had dropped a few anonymous tips to the forensic auditors who worked for the minority shareholders of St. James Development. I was no longer just the wife. I was the architect of the collapse. I got out of bed, moved silently to the window, and looked out over the pine forest. The moon was high and cold. I whispered to the glass, a promise to myself. "You told me I'd never touch a dime of your money again, Lysander. You were right, because by the time I'm done, there won't be a single dime left for anyone to touch." The 2 weeks leading up to the gala were a masterclass in psychological warfare. To Lysander and his parents, I had become a ghost, a quiet, helpful presence that ensured the silver was polished and the floral arrangements for the foyer were sufficiently stately. I moved through the mansion like a shadow, my ears always open, my phone always recording. I learned that the Royale merger wasn't just a business move, it was a desperate lifeline. St. James Development had overextended itself on a series of luxury condos in Dubai that were sitting empty, bleeding cash. They needed Magnus Royale's liquid assets to keep the banks from foreclosing on their Atlanta holdings. They were walking a tightrope, and they had no idea I was standing at the end with a pair of shears. Lysander's arrogance was reaching its zenith. He stopped even pretending to go to the office. Kalista was at the house almost every day now, ostensibly consulting on the decor for the gala, but in reality, she was marking her territory. She would walk into the kitchen while I was speaking with the chef and demand changes in a voice that didn't acknowledge my existence. No, the caviar must be beluga, and tell the help to keep the champagne flowing, the vintage Krug, not the standard label, she would say, looking right through me. I would just nod and smile, the same plastic smile I had perfected over 8 years. I wasn't the wife anymore. I was the executive producer of a tragedy they were all starring in. One afternoon, I found Kalista in my dressing room. She was holding up my favorite silk dress, the one I had worn on my 5th anniversary, back when I still believed Lysander loved me. She was sneering at it, her fingers tracing the hem with a look of profound disgust. "This is so quaint," she whispered to herself. When she saw me in the mirror, she didn't even startle. She just dropped the dress on the floor. "Aziza, darling, you really must clear this clutter out before next week. We'll be turning this wing into my private studio. I'm sure Lysander has told you about the arrangements." "He has mentioned a fresh start," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. I walked over, picked up the dress, and folded it carefully. "I'm sure you'll find the space very accommodating, Kalista. It has a wonderful view of the gates. You can see everyone coming and going. It's perfect for someone who likes to keep an eye on their investments." She laughed, a high tinkling sound that reminded me of breaking glass. "You're surprisingly resilient for a girl with no fallback plan. Most women in your position would be hysterical. But then again, I suppose you knew this day was coming from the moment you walked down the aisle. A girl like you is a placeholder, Aziza, a palate cleanser before the main course." I looked her in the eyes, really looked at her. Beneath the diamonds and the designer clothes, I saw a woman who was just as much a tool for her father as I had been for Lysander. She thought she was the queen, but she was just another piece on the board. "The main course is always the most expensive part of the meal, Kalista," I said softly. "I hope it doesn't leave a bitter taste in your mouth." She rolled her eyes and swept out of the room, her perfume lingering like a toxic cloud. I waited until I heard her heels clicking down the hallway before I pulled out my hidden laptop. I had a new message from Elena Vance. We had found the smoking gun. It was a digital ledger hidden within the Northvest holding server. It wasn't just tracking money, it was tracking bribes. Lysander had been paying off members of the city's zoning committee to fast-track the waterfront project. The payments were disguised as art acquisitions through a gallery Kalista owned in Soho. It was a perfect circle of corruption. The St. James family got their permits, Magnus Royale laundered his cash, and Kalista got a nice commission. It was beautiful, in a disgusting sort of way. "I have the offshore routing numbers," Elena's message read, "and I have the testimony from the former CFO of St. James Development. He's tired of being the fall guy. He's ready to talk to the authorities, but only if we can guarantee him immunity. I told him we aren't the authorities, we're the vengeance." I typed back quickly. "Keep him on ice. We don't move until the gala. I want the signatures on that merger to be drying when the walls close in. I want Magnus Royale to be linked to the St. James family so tightly that when one sinks, the other is dragged straight to the bottom." The pressure was mounting. Octavia had started treating me like a servant in front of the staff, openly discussing my departure with the head housekeeper. "We'll need the master suite deep cleaned by Sunday morning," she had said right in front of me. The previous occupant had, let's say, a very middle-class sense of hygiene. The staff, who had always been kind to me, looked away in shame. I just kept my head down. I was a ghost, and ghosts don't feel shame. The night before the gala, Lysander came into the library where I was pretend reading a book on Victorian architecture. He looked stressed, a vein pulsing in his forehead. He poured himself a double scotch and stood by the fireplace, staring at the family portrait that hung above the mantel, the one where I looked happy and he looked regal. "It's almost over, Aziza," he said, not looking at me. "Tomorrow night, the world changes. The St. James name will be bigger than it's ever been. We're going global." "And what happens to the things that don't fit into that global world, Lysander?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes cold and distant. "They get left behind. It's the law of nature. You've been a good wife, in your own way. You provided a stable home while I built this. But the person I am now, he needs more than stability. He needs power. And power is something you can't even comprehend." "You're right," I said, closing my book. "I've spent so long looking at the pennies that I missed the big picture. But I'm learning. I've learned so much in the last few months." He looked at me for a second, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes, but then his phone buzzed, a text from Kalista, no doubt, and the moment passed. "Go to bed, Aziza. You have a long day tomorrow. I want you looking your best when you stand by the door. I want everyone to see exactly what I'm moving on from." I watched him walk out, his shoulders broad with the weight of his own ego. I didn't go to bed. I went to the basement, to the old trunk where I kept my things from my life before the St. James family. I pulled out a small leather-bound folder. Inside was my birth certificate, my old passport, and a single photograph of me on my graduation day, looking fierce and full of hope. I looked at the woman in the photo. She had been buried under 8 years of etiquette and obedience. She had been told she was nothing without the St. James name. But as I sat there in the dark, I felt her waking up. I felt her rage and her intellect and her sheer, unadulterated will to survive. Tomorrow, the St. James family would host the gala of a lifetime. They would toast to their brilliance and their wealth and their future. They would sign the papers that would make them the most powerful family in the city. And I would be there, right at the door, just like Lysander wanted. I would be there to watch the exact moment the trap snapped shut. I checked my bag one last time. Inside was the envelope I would give the judge weeks later, the one that would make her laugh with pure, unbridled joy. But tonight, it held the keys to a kingdom that was about to burn. "The palate cleanser is finished," I whispered to the empty room. "Now, let's serve the final course." The night of the Royale St. James merger gala arrived with a chilling, cinematic perfection. The Buckhead mansion was transformed into a cathedral of excess. Thousands of white orchids hung from the ceilings, their scent so thick it was almost suffocating. The driveway was a conveyor belt of black Maybachs and silver Rolls-Royces, spilling out the city's power brokers, all of them dressed in silk and arrogance. Inside, the air hummed with the sound of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal flutes. This was the pinnacle of the St. James dynasty, the moment their bloodline would merge with the Royale fortune to create something invincible. I stood by the entrance, just as Lysander had ordered. I wore a simple, high-necked black dress, elegant but designed to make me look like a mourning widow amidst a sea of peacocks. Lysander stood a few feet away, radiant in a bespoke tuxedo. Beside him was Kalista, a vision in a shimmering gold gown that looked like liquid fire. She wasn't just a guest, she was acting as the hostess. She greeted the senators and CEOs with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. Every time someone looked at me with a confused, pitying expression, Kalista would lean in and whisper, "That's just Aziza. She's helping out with the transition." Octavia swept past me, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of rebellion. "You're doing well, Aziza," she murmured, not stopping. "Stay in the shadows. We don't want any awkward questions about the divorce until the papers are signed tomorrow." She moved on to greet Magnus Royale, who entered the room like a conqueror. He was a man of immense gravity, his eyes cold and calculating. When he shook Pearl St. James's hand, it wasn't a greeting, it was a merger of two predators. Around 10 p.m., the music dimmed. Lysander stepped onto the grand staircase, a microphone in his hand. The room fell silent. He looked down at the crowd, his gaze lingering on Kalista with a proprietary heat. "Tonight," he began, his voice booming with confidence, "we celebrate more than just a business arrangement. We celebrate a vision of the future. St. James Development and Royale Holdings are no longer competitors. We are a single force, dedicated to reshaping the skyline of this city." As he spoke, I felt a vibration in my clutch bag. A text from Elena Vance. The files have been uploaded to the SEC portal. The anonymous tip to the Department of Justice has been confirmed. The timer has started. 15 minutes. I looked at Lysander. He was mid-speech, talking about integrity and legacy. I looked at Pearl and Octavia, who were beaming with a pride that was rooted in greed. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully swapped a middle-class girl for a billionaire's daughter and a mountain of cash. They had no idea that the very documents they were about to sign in the library downstairs were now under the digital microscope of federal investigators. "And now," Lysander continued, "I invite our core partners and family to the library for the formal signing of the waterfront merger." The inner circle, the St. James parents, Magnus Royale, Kalista, and their lead attorneys, moved toward the mahogany-paneled library. Lysander shot me a final, dismissive look, a silent command to stay put and keep playing the role of the dutiful ghost. Instead, I followed them. I walked through the heavy double doors just as they were being closed. "Aziza, what are you doing?" Octavia hissed, her face contorting in the dim light of the library. "This is for the principals only. Get out." "I think I should be here, Octavia," I said, my voice cutting through the room with a sudden, sharp clarity. After all, as the legal wife of the CEO of St. James Development, I have a significant interest in where the company's assets are being moved. Lysander turned, his face darkening. "Aziza, don't make a scene. We talked about this. You're getting your settlement. Go back to the party." Magnus Royale looked at Pearl. "Is this going to be a problem, Pearl? I don't like loose ends." "It's no problem," Pearl growled, stepping toward me. "Aziza, leave now or I'll have security remove you." I didn't move. I pulled a small silver remote from my pocket. It was connected to the library's state-of-the-art projection system, the one Lysander used for high-stakes presentations. With a click, the massive screen hidden behind the bookshelves lowered. Another click, and the screen flickered to life. It wasn't a presentation about the waterfront project, it was a spreadsheet, a very specific spreadsheet. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Northvest Holding, Offshore Distribution Log." The room went deathly silent. Lysander's face went from flushed with anger to a sickly, pale gray. He recognized the numbers. He recognized the names of the shell companies, and he recognized the consulting fees paid to Kalista Royale. "What is this?" Magnus Royale demanded, his voice a low thunder. "This," I said, stepping into the center of the room, "is the truth about how the St. James family is funding their side of this merger. It's a map of embezzlement, insider trading, and tax evasion. And look at the second tab, Magnus. Your daughter isn't just a designer. She's been receiving millions in kickbacks from St. James Development for 2 years, kickbacks that were never reported to your board." Kalista's eyes went wide. "Lysander, what did you do? How did she get this?" "I got it because you all thought I was too stupid to look," I said, looking directly at Octavia. "You thought I was something you stepped in, but while you were busy folded napkins and mocking my provincial taste, I was auditing your lives. I know about the bribes to the zoning board. I know about the empty condos in Dubai, and I know that this merger isn't a growth strategy. It's a bailout for a failing, corrupt dynasty." "Shut it off!" Lysander screamed, lunging for the remote. I tossed it onto the massive oak table, well out of his reach. "It doesn't matter if you shut it off now," I said calmly. "The same data was sent to the SEC and the IRS 10 minutes ago, and to the lead editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. By tomorrow morning, the St. James name won't be on a new skyscraper. It will be on a series of indictments." Pearl St. James looked like he was having a heart attack. He sank into a leather chair, his hands trembling. Magnus Royale turned to Lysander, his expression one of pure, murderous loathing. "You brought a federal investigation into my house? You used my daughter to hide your filth?" "Magnus, I can explain," Lysander started, but Magnus silenced him with a raised hand. "The merger is dead," Magnus said. "And if my lawyers find so much as a scratch on Royale Holdings because of your incompetence, I will spend every penny I have to make sure you rot in a cage." He grabbed Kalista's arm. "We're leaving, now." As they swept out of the room, Kalista looked at me. For the first time, the pity was gone. In its place was a naked, shivering fear. She had been the main course, but she was the one who had been devoured. The library was silent now, except for the heavy breathing of the 3 St. Jameses. Octavia was staring at me as if she were seeing a demon. "You've destroyed us," she whispered. "Everything we built. For what? A bigger divorce check?" I walked up to her until we were inches apart. "No, Octavia, not for a check. I did it because for 8 years, you made me feel like I didn't exist. You took my career, my friends, and my dignity. You told me I'd never touch a dime of his money, and you were right. I don't want his money. I want his legacy turned to ash." I looked at Lysander, who was staring at the screen, watching his secret empire blink in the glow of the projector. He looked small. He looked pathetic. "The divorce hearing is in 3 weeks, Lysander," I said, heading for the door. "Make sure you wear your best suit. It'll probably be the last thing you own that isn't seized by the government." I walked out of the library, through the ballroom where the music was still playing, and out into the cool Georgia night. I didn't look back. For the first time in 8 years, I could breathe. The 3 weeks following the gala were a blur of sirens, headlines, and a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped spinning. I didn't return to the mansion. That night, after walking out of the library, I had driven straight to a small, secure hotel Elena Vance had pre-booked for me under a name that wasn't St. James. I left the keys to the Honda Civic on the marble console of the foyer. I left the designer clothes and the jewelry. I left with nothing but a small suitcase of things that actually belonged to me and the digital keys to the St. James's destruction. The news broke at 6 a.m. the next morning. It started as a whisper on financial blogs and erupted into a firestorm by noon. "St. James development under federal investigation," the banners screamed. "Royale merger collapses amid allegations of massive fraud." The image of the Buckhead mansion, usually a symbol of unreachable prestige, was now plastered across every news channel, surrounded by black SUVs and agents carrying boxes of evidence. I watched it all from my hotel room, sipping a cup of coffee that I had paid for with my own money I had slowly funneled from my household allowance into a private account over the last few months. Every time a news anchor mentioned Lysander's name, I felt a strange, cold detachment. He wasn't the man I had loved anymore. He was a case study in the consequences of hubris. Elena Vance arrived at my hotel on the 3rd day. She looked exhausted but exhilarated. She dropped a stack of papers on the bed. "The fallout is even bigger than we anticipated, Aziza. Mistress Royale has completely disavowed the St. James family. He's filed a civil suit against Lysander for 10 times the amount of the initial merger value, claiming he was defrauded into a criminal partnership. And Kalista? Her art gallery has been shuttered. The IRS is looking into every consulting fee she ever received." I leaned back against the headboard. "And Lysander?" "He's in a tailspin," Elena said with a grim smile. "He's been out on bail, but his assets are frozen. He's staying at his parents' house because the bank has already started the foreclosure process on the Buckhead mansion. Pearl and Octavia are being investigated as co-conspirators. The board of St. James Development has officially removed them all from their positions. The dynasty is currently a crime scene." "It's not enough," I said softly. Elena looked at me, her brow furrowing. "Aziza, you've won. You've destroyed their reputation, their company, and their future. What more do you want?" "I want the hearing," I said. "I want to see them in a room where they are forced to acknowledge my existence. I want the final signature on the one document they can't avoid." The days leading up to the divorce hearing were marked by desperate attempts at contact. Lysander called me dozens of times from various burner phones. I didn't answer. He sent emails ranging from tearful apologies to venomous threats. He tried to claim he was tricked by his father and Mistress Royale. He tried to tell me he still loved me, that we could take the hidden money, the money he thought I didn't find, and start over in South America. He still didn't realize that I knew about every single penny. He still thought I was the girl he could manipulate with a kiss and a promise. Octavia even tried to find me. She showed up at my old office, demanding to know where I was, causing such a scene that security had to escort her out. The Queen of Buckhead was unraveling. The X-ray vision she used to judge my napkins was now turned inward, and she couldn't handle the flaws she found in her own reflection. But it was Pearl St. James who surprised me. He sent a physical letter, hand-delivered to Elena's office. It was brief and written in the shaky hand of a man who knew he was dying. "Aziza," it read, "you were the only thing in that house that was real. We spent 8 years trying to turn you into a statue, and instead, you became the fire that burned us down. I don't ask for forgiveness. I only ask that you finish what you started, quickly." The suspense is more than my heart can take. I didn't reply to him either. I was focused on the envelope, the one the judge would eventually open. You see, everyone, the lawyers, the media, the St. James family, thought the North Vest leak was my final move. They thought the divorce hearing would just be a standard procedure to divide the scraps of a bankrupt estate. They didn't realize that I had been playing a much longer game. During my time as a ghost in the mansion, I hadn't just been looking for financial fraud. I had been looking for the source of the St. James power. I had discovered that 30 years ago, Pearl St. James hadn't built the company from nothing. He had stolen the initial patents and land deeds from a group of local families in a marginalized part of the city, using a series of predatory legal maneuvers that were technically legal but morally bankrupt. One of those families was mine. My grandfather had owned a small plot of land that was now the center of the St. James Midtown project. He had died penniless and heartbroken after Pearl cheated him out of it. My mother had never told me the full story, wanting me to grow up without bitterness. But when I found the old deeds in the basement of the mansion, the originals that Pearl had kept as trophies, everything changed. I wasn't just a scorned wife. I was the granddaughter of a man they had crushed. My marriage to Lysander hadn't been a lottery of fate. It had been a cosmic irony. And now, I was going to use their own legal system to take back what was rightfully mine. The night before the hearing, I sat in the hotel room and looked at the photo of my grandfather. He was a man with calloused hands and a kind smile. He had died thinking he was a failure because he couldn't provide for his daughter. "Tomorrow, Grandpa," I whispered. "Tomorrow the land comes home." I prepared my outfit for the courtroom. No black widow dress this time. I chose a sharp, tailored suit in a deep, commanding navy. I didn't want to look like a victim, and I didn't want to look like a rebel. I wanted to look like the CEO I was always meant to be. As I laid out my papers, I thought about Lysander's words. "You will never touch a dime of my money again." He was right. I didn't want his money. I wanted his name stripped from the buildings. I wanted the dirt beneath his feet. I wanted the very foundation of his life to acknowledge that it belonged to me. The silence of the room felt different now. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a predator before the strike. I felt a strange sense of peace. For 8 years, I had lived in a world where I was defined by someone else's wealth and someone else's rules. Tomorrow, I would finally state my full name, and the world would finally understand why the judge was going to laugh. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse was surrounded by a sea of cameras and reporters. The St. James scandal had become the focal point of the city's attention. As I stepped out of the car, the flashes were blinding, but I didn't shield my eyes. I walked with my head held high, flanked by Elena Vance and her team. I wasn't the trembling girl from the Buckhead mansion anymore. I was a storm personified. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Lysander was already there, sitting at the defense table. He looked like a ghost of the man I had married. His obsidian-carved profile had sharpened into something gaunt and desperate. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, as if he had shrunken inside his own skin. Behind him sat Octavia and Pearl. Octavia's posture was still rigid, but her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. Pearl sat in a wheelchair now, looking small and defeated, his gaze fixed on the floor. And then there was Kalista. She sat in the back row, a scarf wrapped around her head and dark glasses covering her eyes. She was there to protect what was left of her own reputation, but the way she leaned away from the St. James family spoke volumes. The alliance was dead. The judge, Honorable Sarah Sterling, entered the room with a gravity that silenced the murmurs. She looked over the documents on her bench with a weary expression, until she reached the envelope I had submitted through Elena. As she opened it and began to read, the courtroom held its breath. Then came the laugh. It started as a sharp intake of air and erupted into a genuine, echoing laugh that filled the chamber. It was the sound of justice recognizing its own irony. She took off her glasses, wiping away tears of mirth, and looked at me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "This is the best thing I've read in 20 years on the bench," she declared. "But before we proceed, please, for the record, state your full name. I'm curious to know exactly who is sharing this courtroom with me today." I stood up. I felt the eyes of my husband and his parents burning into my back. I felt the weight of 8 years of silence lifting off my chest. "My name," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "is Aziza Marie Vance Everett, formerly known as Aziza St. James." Lysander stiffened at the name Everett. He looked at his father, whose face had gone a ghostly shade of white. "The court has before it a motion, not just for the dissolution of marriage," Judge Sterling continued, her voice regaining its professional edge, "but a claim for the restitution of ancestral property. Mrs. Vance Everett has provided evidence that the land currently housing the Midtown Waterfront project, as well as the ground beneath the St. James headquarters, was acquired through fraudulent title transfers from her grandfather, Elias Everett, in 1992. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to their feet. Lysander turned around, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and confusion. "What is she talking about, Father?" Pearl didn't look at him. He just closed his eyes and leaned his head back. He knew. "Furthermore," the judge said, silencing the room with a strike of her gavel, "the evidence shows that the Northvest holding accounts, which Mr. St. James claimed were his private assets, were actually funded by the liquidation of Everett family assets. Therefore, by law, those accounts do not belong to the marital estate. They belong in their entirety to the plaintiff as a matter of inheritance and restitution." Lysander leaped to his feet. "That's impossible. That money is mine. I built that. You can't give her everything." "Sit down, Mr. St. James," the judge snapped. "You didn't build it. You stole it. And then you were foolish enough to marry the heir to the family you robbed. If this weren't a court of law, I'd call it poetic justice. As it stands, I call it a closed case." I looked at Lysander. He was staring at me, his mouth agape. He had whispered that I would never touch a dime of his money. He was right. I was touching my money, the money that had been stolen from my grandfather's sweat and my mother's tears. "You knew," Lysander hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You didn't marry me because you loved me. You married me to do this." "No, Lysander," I said softly, loud enough only for the front rows to hear. "I married you because I loved you. I stayed because I believed in the fairy tale, but I destroyed you because you forgot that the girl you brought home had a history before you. You thought you were selecting a technical blueprint of a wife. You didn't realize you were inviting the debt collector into your bedroom." Octavia stood up then, her voice a shrill claw. "You're a snake. You lived in our house, ate our food, wore the clothes we bought you." "I wore the clothes my grandfather's land paid for, Octavia," I interrupted. "And as for the provincial taste you hated so much, you'll be glad to know I'm clearing it all out. Since the mansion sits on Everett land, the deed has been reverted. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. I've already hired a crew to fold your napkins into packing crates." Octavia collapsed back into her seat. The Queen of Buckhead was officially homeless. The judge looked at me and nodded. "The court grants the decree of divorce. The assets listed in the Everett restitution claim are frozen and will be transferred to the plaintiff immediately. Mr. St. James, you are ordered to surrender all passports and remain in the jurisdiction pending the federal fraud investigation." As the judge rose to leave, I turned to walk out. Lysander scrambled toward me, but security blocked his path. "Aziza," he shouted, "you can't do this. We can talk. We can settle this." I stopped and looked back at him over my shoulder. I didn't feel hatred anymore. I didn't even feel the rage that had fueled me for months. I just felt light. "There's nothing left to settle, Lysander. You said it yourself. I'll never touch a dime of your money. And I won't, because you don't have any left." I walked out of the courtroom and into the lobby, where a throng of reporters was waiting. Elena Vance stepped forward to give a statement, but I kept walking. I walked down the stone steps of the courthouse, feeling the sun on my face. For 8 years, I had been a butterfly under glass. Today, the glass was shattered. And as I looked at the city skyline, the buildings that bore the name St. James, I knew that by tomorrow, those letters would be coming down. I took out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice small and curious. "Mom?" I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's over. We're going home, and we're taking the land with us." The silence that followed the courtroom explosion was the most expensive sound I had ever heard. Within hours, the legal machinery I had set in motion began to tear the St. James world apart with the same cold precision they had once used to isolate me. The St. James name, once synonymous with old money grace and untouchable power, was being scrubbed from the city's consciousness. It wasn't just a divorce, it was an exorcism. I drove back to the Buckhead mansion one last time. I didn't take the Honda Civic. I took a sleek, black SUV driven by a security detail Elena Vance had insisted upon. As we pulled up to the iron gates, the security guard, a man who had ignored me for 8 years, now stood at attention, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. He didn't ask for my ID. He simply pushed the button, and the gate swung open for the rightful owner. The house looked different now. The floor-to-ceiling windows that used to feel like prison bars now looked like fragile glass. The Italian furniture looked like clutter. I walked into the foyer, and the scent of white orchids, the ones from the gala, was rotting. It smelled like the end of something. Octavia was in the solarium. She wasn't drinking tea today. She was frantically throwing items into a series of Louis Vuitton suitcases. Her movements were jagged. Her hair, usually a perfect silver helmet, was disheveled. When she saw me, she froze, clutching a crystal vase to her chest like a weapon. "You have no right to be here," she spat, though her voice lacked its usual venom. It sounded thin, like paper tearing. "Actually, Octavia, I have every right," I said, walking slowly into the room. The court order was very specific. This house sits on the Everett estate. The structure, the land, and everything not deemed personal property, acquired prior to 1992, belongs to the trust. I'm here to oversee the transition. She looked around the room, her eyes darting to the expensive paintings, the silk curtains, the history she had meticulously curated. "We made you," she whispered. "We took a girl from a regular apartment and gave her a throne, and this is how you thank us? By making us homeless?" "You didn't give me a throne, Octavia. You gave me a cage and told me to be grateful for the gold plating," I replied. "And you didn't make me. You tried to erase me. But you forgot that you can't erase a foundation. My grandfather's blood is in the soil under this house. You've been living on a debt for 30 years. I'm just here to collect the interest." She let out a strangled cry and shoved the vase into a suitcase. "Lysander will fight this. He's a St. James. He has connections you can't even imagine." "Lysander is currently at the federal building being questioned about the North Vest accounts," I said calmly. "And as for his connections? Magnus Royale has already filed for a restraining order against your family. The connections are all running for cover. No one wants to be near the St. James name when the indictments start dropping." I walked past her to the grand piano, the one Pearl used to play when he wanted to feel like a patriarch. I ran my finger over the keys. It was out of tune. "The movers will be here at sunset, Octavia. I've instructed them to be efficient. Anything left behind will be donated to the Decatur Community Center. I think they could use some Italian leather sofas." I left her there, shivering in her silk robes, and went up to the master suite. I didn't want the jewelry or the designer bags. I went straight to the hidden safe in the closet. I didn't need a code. The federal marshals had already cracked it. Inside, nestled among the gold bars and the offshore ledgers, was a small wooden box. I opened it. Inside were the original deeds to the Everett farm. My grandfather's signature was at the bottom, a shaky, honest hand, and next to it, the forged signature of a young Pearl St. James. I held the paper to my chest, and finally, for the first time since the gala, I cried. Not for the marriage I lost, but for the justice that had taken so long to arrive. By evening, the mansion was a hive of activity. Men in uniforms were carrying out the St. James legacy in cardboard boxes. I stood on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the pine trees. The forest didn't look like a dark, encroaching wall anymore. It looked like home. A car pulled up the driveway, a modest sedan. My mother stepped out. She looked at the massive house, then at the moving trucks, and finally at me. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked over and took my hand. "Elias always said the land has a memory, Aziza," she whispered. "He told me before he died that one day the truth would grow back, no matter how much concrete they poured over it." "We're going to change it, Mom," I said. "The St. James name is coming off the gates tomorrow. We're turning this place into a foundation, a school for young women who want to start their own businesses. No one will ever have to just ask for a cup of coffee here again." My mother smiled, a real, radiant smile. "What will you call it?" I looked at the gate, where the gold S.J. crest was being unscrewed by a workman. "The Everett Institute, because a name should be something you earn, not something you use to hide your crimes." As night fell, the last of the St. James family departed. Pearl was taken in a medical transport to a private facility, paid for by a trust I had graciously allowed to remain for his care. Octavia left in a hired car, refusing to look back. And Lysander wasn't there. He was still in a holding cell, waiting for a bail hearing that no one was coming to attend. I stood in the empty foyer, the echo of the moving boots still hanging in the air. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a lonely quiet. It was the silence of a clean slate. I took out my phone and looked at the news one last time. The lead story was a photo of the St. James Development Building downtown. A massive crane was already positioned near the roof, ready to remove the signage. The empire was officially in ruins. I felt a vibration in my hand, a text from an unknown number. I knew it was Lysander's lawyer, or perhaps one of his remaining associates. I didn't even open it. I deleted the thread and blocked the number. I walked to the front door, turned off the lights of the mansion, and stepped out onto the porch. I didn't lock the door behind me. I didn't have to. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't afraid of what was inside. "Are you ready?" my mother asked from the car. "I've been ready for 8 years, Mom," I said. As we drove down the long, winding driveway, I looked into the rearview mirror. The mansion was dark, a silhouette against the Georgia sky. It no longer looked like a palace. It looked like a monument to a dead lie. And as the gates closed behind us, I felt the final piece of the St. James wife fall away, leaving only the woman I was always meant to be. The fall of the House of St. James was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacular public disintegration that served as a cautionary tale for the city's elite. For weeks after the hearing, the headlines refused to die down. The Everett restitution became a landmark case, studied by law students and discussed on every talk show. But while the world whispered about the millions and the corruption, I was focused on the wreckage left behind. I realized that destroying an empire is only half the work. The other half is cleaning up the debris. I spent the next month in a whirlwind of meetings, but they were different now. I wasn't the one sitting in the corner, nodding while men discussed my fate. I was at the head of the table. Elena Vance remained by my side, not just as my lawyer, but as the architect of my new corporate reality. We were dismantling St. James Development piece by piece, separating the legitimate assets from the fruits of Pearl's original theft. One afternoon, Elena walked into the temporary office I had set up in a bright, modern building downtown. A building that had no mahogany, no heavy drapes, and no secrets. She looked grim, holding a manila folder. "Lysander's legal team is pushing for a plea deal," she said, sitting across from me. "The federal prosecutors are willing to drop the most serious racketeering charges if he testifies against the zoning board members he bribed. But there's a condition. He wants to see you, Aziza, one last time. He says he won't sign the deal unless he can talk to you face to face." I looked out the window. From here, I could see the construction site of the Midtown Waterfront project. The cranes were idle, draped in under new management banners. "He's still trying to negotiate," I said, a small, tired smile playing on my lips. "Even in a jumpsuit, he thinks he's the one holding the cards." "You don't have to do it," Elena reminded me. "The evidence we have is ironclad. He's going to prison regardless. This is just a power play." "No," I said, standing up. "I'll go. I want to see if the mask is finally off." The meeting took place in a sterile gray room at the Federal Detention Center. When Lysander was let in, the clink of his handcuffs was the only sound in the room. He looked worse than he had in court. His skin was sallow, and the arrogance that used to radiate from him like a heat signature had been replaced by a flickering, frantic energy. He sat down, and for a long moment we just stared at each other. This was the man I had slept next to for nearly 3,000 nights. This was the man who had whispered, "I got incredibly lucky with Aziza," to his friends, while secretly planning to replace me with a more profitable model. "You look well," he said, his voice raspy. "Wealth suits you. I suppose I should say your wealth." "I look like myself, Lysander," I replied. "It's a look you never bothered to notice." He leaned forward, as far as his restraints would allow. "Why did you go so far, Aziza? You could have just divorced me. You could have taken a settlement and lived comfortably for the rest of your life. Why did you have to burn down the company? Why did you have to destroy my father?" "Your father destroyed himself the moment he stole that land in 1992, I said. "And you destroyed yourself when you decided that people were just instruments to be played. You didn't just break a marriage, Lysander. You tried to erase my humanity. You tried to make me a ghost in my own life. I didn't burn down your company. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the rot." He laughed then, a dry, bitter sound. "You think you're so much better than us, but look at you now. You're the most powerful woman in the city because you played the game better than I did. You used the same secrets, the same leverage, the same cold-blooded calculation. You're a St. James in everything but name." "That's where you're wrong," I said, leaning in. "A St. James builds on top of people. I'm building for them. I've already signed over 40% of the North Vest funds to a housing trust for the families your father displaced. I'm not playing the game, Lysander. I'm ending it." He recoiled as if I'd struck him. The idea of giving away money he had risked everything to hide, was clearly more painful to him than the prospect of prison. "You're a fool," he hissed. "You'll be broke in 5 years. You don't have the stomach for this world." "I have the stomach to look at myself in the mirror," I said, standing up to leave. "Which is something you'll have plenty of time to practice in your cell. Sign the plea deal, Lysander. Not for me, but for your mother. She's living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Smyrna. She needs whatever dignity you have left to keep her going." As I walked toward the door, he called out my name one last time. "Aziza, did you ever love me, even for a second?" I paused with my hand on the heavy steel handle. I thought about the Friday flowers. I thought about the first 3 years in the fog of Buckhead. "I loved the man I thought you were," I said without turning around. "But that man never existed. He was just a ghost you created to keep me quiet. And I don't believe in ghosts anymore." I walked out of the detention center and into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt clean. The following week, the final St. James sign was removed from the corporate headquarters. It was a media event. A crowd had gathered to watch the giant gold letters being lowered by a crane. I stood across the street, wearing a hard hat and a safety vest, surrounded by the new board of the Everett Institute. As the S and the J touched the ground, a cheer went up from the crowd, many of them former employees who had been mistreated or underpaid during the St. James era. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Pearl's former secretary, a woman named Mrs. Higgins who had worked for the family for 30 years. "I never thought I'd see the day," she whispered, her eyes misty. "He always told us the name was permanent. He said names like St. James were written in stone." "Nothing is written in stone, Mrs. Higgins," I said. "Only the truth." That evening, I returned to the mansion. It was empty now, the echoes of Octavia's screams and Lysander's demands replaced by the quiet rustle of the wind in the pines. I sat on the back terrace, watching the fireflies dance over the lawn. I took out a pen and a piece of paper. I began to write a list. Not a list of assets or a list of enemies, but a list of dreams. I wanted to travel. I wanted to finish my degree. I wanted to reopen the agency I had walked away from 8 years ago. I looked at the house one last time. Tomorrow, the architects would arrive to begin the conversion into the institute. The walls would be knocked down, the guest rooms would be turned into classrooms, and the library would finally be filled with books that people actually read. I felt a sense of completion. The butterfly wasn't under glass anymore. She was outside, in the wind, finally finding her own direction. The transformation was final. 6 months had passed since the day in the courtroom, and the city of Atlanta had moved on to newer scandals and fresher faces. But for me, the world had slowed down into a beautiful, deliberate rhythm. The Buckhead Mansion was no longer a monument to a cold dynasty. It was the Everett Institute for Female Empowerment. The floor-to-ceiling windows now let in light for young women huddled over business plans and architectural drafts. The Italian furniture had been replaced by communal tables and beanbag chairs, and the manicured lawn, once a forbidden golf course, was now a community garden where the neighborhood children played. I stood on the balcony of what used to be the master suite. It was now my private office, though the door was rarely closed. I looked down at the entrance. The iron gates were gone, replaced by an open archway made of local stone. On it, the name Everett was carved simply and deeply. It didn't need gold leaf to be seen. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a news notification. Final sentencing in St. James fraud case. I didn't need to click it to know the outcome. Lysander had been sentenced to 12 years in a federal facility. Pearl had passed away peacefully in his sleep a month prior, his last act being a signed confession that cleared the final legal hurdles for the restitution. And Octavia? She had moved back to the small town in South Carolina she had spent 40 years pretending she wasn't from. The Queen had returned to the soil, and the soil didn't care about her etiquette. A soft knock at the door pulled me back to the present. It was a young woman named Maya, one of our first scholarship recipients. She was from a regular apartment in Decatur, much like I had been. She held a folder close to her chest, her eyes bright with the same fire I had rediscovered in myself. "Ms. Vance Everett, the board is ready for the first quarter presentation," she said, her voice steady. "And there's someone downstairs asking for you. She says she's an old friend." I walked down the grand staircase, the same one where Lysander had stood to announce a merger that would have buried me. At the bottom stood Kenyon. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. Lysander had convinced me she was unrefined and jealous of my lifestyle, and I, in my ecstatic fog, had let her go. She looked at me, taking in the sharp suit, the natural hair I no longer chemically straightened to please Octavia, and the sheer presence I now occupied. She didn't say a word. She just opened her arms. I ran the last few steps and hugged her, the scent of her familiar cocoa butter lotion bringing back a flood of memories of late-night pizza and dreams that had nothing to do with Italian furniture. "I saw the news," Kenyon whispered, pulling back to look at me. "I saw the girl from Decatur take down a king. I knew you were still in there, Aziza. I just didn't know you were planning a revolution." "I wasn't planning one, Kenyon," I said, wiping a stray tear. "I was just trying to find my way home. I'm sorry it took me so long." "You're here now," she smiled, "and from what I hear, you own the neighborhood." We spent the afternoon walking through the institute. I showed her the classrooms, the incubator for small businesses, and the library. We sat in the garden, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I had a cup of coffee that didn't feel like a line item on an interrogation sheet. We laughed until our sides ached, reclaiming the years the St. James family had stolen from us. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows over the Everett estate, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the money or the land. It was the lack of fear. I no longer looked over my shoulder. I didn't check my bank balance with a racing heart. I didn't wait for a man's forehead kiss to feel validated. I was the architect, the builder, and the resident of my own life. That evening, I drove my new car, a practical, high-end electric vehicle I had chosen and paid for myself, down to the old apartment complex in Decatur. I parked at the curb and looked up at the window of the unit where I grew up. It was a modest place, but it was where I had learned the values that Lysander couldn't break: resilience, integrity, and the strength of a woman who knows her worth. I took out my phone and looked at a photo I had saved. It was a picture of the judge from that day, laughing so hard she had to wipe away tears. I finally understood the full depth of that laugh. It wasn't just about the irony of the land. It was a laugh of recognition. She had seen through the St. James wife mask to the woman underneath, the woman who had been quiet but never truly silenced. I drove back to Buckhead, but I didn't go to the mansion. I went to a small, modern house I had bought on the edge of the property. It was filled with books I loved, art that spoke to me, and a kitchen that was always messy because I actually enjoyed cooking in it. My mother was there, sitting on the porch, watching the stars. "Are you happy, Aziza?" she asked as I sat down beside her. I looked out at the horizon. In the distance, the lights of the city twinkled, no longer a battlefield but a landscape of possibility. I thought about the girl who had entered the gala 8 years ago, and I thought about the woman sitting here now. "I'm more than happy, Mom," I said, taking her hand. "I'm free." The St. James family had wanted me to be a butterfly under glass, pinned, beautiful, and dead. But they forgot one thing about butterflies. They don't just sit there. They transform. They go through the dark, they break the shell, and then they fly. As I closed my eyes that night, I didn't hear the echoes of Lysander's whispers or Octavia's insults. I heard the sound of the wind through the pines on the Everett land. It was a song of reclamation. I had touched every dime, and I had used it to buy back my soul. The story of the St. James wife was over. The story of Aziza Vance Everett was just beginning. And as I drifted into a sleep that was finally, truly my own, I knew that the best thing I had ever read in 20 years, or a lifetime, was the unspoken chapter of my own future.